Dive into the chilling, spine-tingling tales that'll keep you up at night? Make sure to subscribe for your daily dose of fear. And don't forget to hit the like button and leave a comment about your favorite part of today's story. Want even more exclusive scares? Join our membership for members-only live streams and stories you won't find anywhere else. Your next nightmare awaits. Let's get into it. Story 1. The Blackwood Forest has stood for centuries, its ancient pines reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. Local residents know better than to venture past its borders after sunset, but Sarah Chen, a wildlife photographer, didn't believe in old wives' tales. She'd won awards for her night photography, capturing moments that others missed. The Blackwood Forest, she thought, would be her masterpiece. The day started normally enough. Sarah set up her equipment at various locations, marking GPS coordinates and checking light angles. As the sun set, she felt the usual thrill of anticipation. The moon rose full and heavy, casting phantom shapes through the canopy. Her camera captured the usual: owls, deer, the occasional fox. But as midnight approached, something changed. The forest fell silent. Not the natural quiet of a woodland night, but an absolute absence of sound that made her ears ring. Through her viewfinder, she noticed something odd. The shadows weren't falling the way they should. They moved against the wind, twisting into impossible shapes. Her first instinct was to check her camera's settings. That's when she saw them through the lens. Figures moving between the trees, too tall to be human, too fluid to be natural. Their limbs bent at impossible angles, and where their faces should have been, there were only swirling patterns of darkness. Sarah's hands shook as she checked the photos she'd just taken. Each image showed more of the figures than the last, and they were getting closer. In the final shot, one was standing directly behind her, its elongated fingers reaching for her shoulder. She ran. Branches whipped at her face as she stumbled through the undergrowth, her expensive camera forgotten. But every time she looked back, the moonlight revealed more of the figures, their bodies twisting through the trees like smoke. They weren't chasing her, they were hurting her. The photographs she took that night were never developed. They found her camera 3 days later, its memory card corrupted, along with deep gouges in the bark of nearby trees. Gouges that formed patterns similar to ancient runes, but no linguistic expert has been able to decipher them. Sarah herself emerged on the 4th day, but the woman who walked out of those woods wasn't quite the same as the one who entered. She speaks only in whispers now, and never about what she saw beneath the moonlit canopy. But on full moon nights, she can be seen at her window, taking photographs of the empty street below. When asked why, she always gives the same answer: they're not empty. The moon shows us what's really there. The strangest part? When her photos are developed, they show only static, except for one corner, where, if you look closely, you might see something reaching toward the camera. Story 2. Millbrook Village seems ordinary enough during daylight hours. Picturesque even, with its colonial architecture and tree-lined streets. But when darkness falls and the moon rises, the whispers begin. They start as gentle murmurs, like leaves rustling in a breeze, but grow more distinct as night deepens. Eleanor Wright, the village librarian, was the first to notice the pattern. It began last summer, she recalls, her fingers nervously adjusting her glasses. Just fragments at first, a child's laughter, snippets of conversation, but they knew things. She pauses, her hands trembling. They knew secrets only the dead should know. Eleanor's first encounter happened while locking up the library. She heard someone reciting The Raven in her father's voice, her father who had passed away 20 years ago. But it wasn't just reciting, it was their private game, where he would deliberately mispronounce words to make her laugh. Nobody else knew about that. Other villagers soon came forward with similar experiences. Tom Miller, the baker, heard his long-deceased mother's recipe for sourdough bread, including the secret ingredient she'd never written down. Mary Patterson, the schoolteacher, recognized the voice of Jimmy Wells, a student who passed away in 1985, reciting the last essay he'd written before his death. But it's what the whispers predict that truly terrifies them, because so far, every prophecy has come true. They warned of old Mrs. Henderson's fall 3 days before it happened. They spoke of the Anderson twins' disappearance a week before the girls vanished. And now, they're speaking of something bigger coming. They're getting louder, Eleanor confides, glancing at the darkening sky. And they're not just whispers anymore. They're organizing, like a choir practicing for some terrible performance. Last night, I heard them counting down. The most disturbing development occurred during last month's lunar eclipse. As the moon's light dimmed, the whispers rose to a crescendo, and for just a moment they spoke in unison. When the 13th moon of the year shines full, the door will open. They're so hungry. Researchers have attempted to record the whispers, but their equipment always malfunctions. Digital recordings fill with static, while analog tapes play back in reverse time. One team from a prestigious university left behind thousands of dollars of equipment after their lead investigators spent just one night in the village. His only explanation was a hastily scribbled note. They are not echoes of the dead. They're practices for the living. Story 3. The old Henderson cabin stands alone on the northwestern ridge, its windows dark and shutters hanging askew. 5 college friends thought it would make the perfect spot for a weekend getaway. They didn't know about its history, about the family that vanished there in 1973, or the strange symbols carved into its foundation stones. They didn't know that every full moon, the cabin's shadows move in ways that defy physics. Mark Rodriguez, the only one who can still speak coherently about that night, shared his account from his hospital bed, his eyes never quite focusing on anything in the room. "We thought the footsteps were just the house settling," he explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "But houses don't settle in perfect rhythm. Houses don't whisper your name in voices you've heard before, voices that belong to people you know are dead." The group arrived on Friday afternoon. Everything seemed normal at first. They unpacked, chose rooms, started preparing dinner. Jessica even joked about the typical horror movie setup, 5 friends in a remote cabin. If only they'd known. The first sign came at sunset. The shadows cast by their flashlights began to move independently of the lights themselves. Small things at first. A shadow hand waving when its owner was still. A silhouette walking in the opposite direction of its caster. By midnight, we couldn't trust what we were seeing, Mark continued. The moonlight through the windows, it showed things that couldn't be there. Rooms that didn't exist during the day. People we knew weren't with us. Standing in corners, staring. They tried to leave, but the road had changed. Every path led back to the cabin, no matter which direction they took. Their phones showed different times, different dates. Messages sent to friends turned into gibberish about the space between moments and the hunger of forgotten things. Only 3 of the 5 friends made it out that weekend. The other 2, Jessica Chen and Mike Torres, were found weeks later, huddled in the cabin's cellar. Their hair turned white, repeating the same phrase over and over. The moon showed us what lives between seconds. The search team reported other disturbing findings. The cabin's interior dimensions didn't match its exterior. Rooms appeared and disappeared depending on who was looking. And most troublingly, all the mirrors showed reflections that moved a few seconds before the people they were supposed to be reflecting. Jessica and Mike remain in psychiatric care. They refuse to sleep when the moon is visible, and they've developed an elaborate system of symbols they draw on their walls, symbols that match those found on the cabin's foundation stones. When asked about their friends who escaped, they respond with the same cryptic warning. They didn't escape. They just haven't realized it yet. Mark was released from the hospital last month. The doctors say he's recovered, but his neighbors report strange occurrences. On full moon nights, his shadow can be seen pacing in his room, even when he's not home. Story 4. They call it the Silver Shade, a figure glimpsed only in moonlight, tall and thin, wearing what appears to be a Victorian greatcoat. Reports date back to the 1800s, each description eerily similar across centuries. It's seen standing motionless on street corners, between graves in old cemeteries, or outside windows on upper floors of buildings, always watching. Officer Kate Murphy's encounter became the most well-documented case in recent history. "I was patrolling near the old cemetery when my flashlight died," she recounts, her professional demeanor cracking slightly at the memory. "In the moonlight, I saw it, standing between the graves. It turned to look at me, but where its face should have been..." She stops, shuddering. "It was like looking at static on an old TV, but deeper somehow, like you could fall into it forever. And then it spoke, not with words, but directly into my mind. It showed me things, futures that haven't happened yet, pasts that never were." Kate's body camera malfunctioned that night, but the dash cam in her patrol car caught something unusual. A tall figure that seemed to shift position between frames, getting closer to the camera without ever appearing to move. The footage ends abruptly with a single frame of what analysts describe as geometrically impossible patterns. Local folklore suggests the silver shade appears to those about to experience great loss. Others claim it's a guardian, protecting the boundary between our world and whatever lies beyond. The truth might be more complex and more terrifying. Dr. Helena Zhang, a paranormal researcher, has spent years tracking silver shade sightings. "There's a pattern," she explains, spreading out a map marked with hundreds of pins. "The appearances form perfect geometric shapes across the landscape, and the intervals between sightings, they're not random, they're counting down to something." The most disturbing theory comes from Marcus Webb, a physicist who's been studying the phenomenon. "What if it's not a ghost or spirit?" he proposes. "What if it's a thin spot in reality? Something trying to push through from elsewhere, and the moonlight just makes it visible to us." All agree on one crucial detail. If you see the silver shade 3 nights in a row, you'll join its eternal vigil. 7 people in the last century have reported their 3rd sighting. All disappeared within 24 hours. Leaving behind only a single photograph showing their own face, with that same static-like distortion where their features should be. The latest development is perhaps the most chilling. People have begun reporting multiple silver shades appearing simultaneously, all facing the same direction, as if watching for something. Or waiting for it. Story 5. Never believed these stories until last winter. I was walking home late, enjoying the crisp air and bright moonlight. That's when I heard it, my own voice, coming from behind me, telling a story I'd never shared. I turned, to find myself staring at myself. But not quite. This other me was speaking about things that hadn't happened yet, events that seemed impossible. Its movements were slightly out of sync, as if it was operating on a different timeline. As I stood, frozen, it reached out with a hand that passed through moonlight like smoke. I ran. But you can't outrun moonlight, and you certainly can't outrun yourself. The things it predicted, they're starting to come true. The car accident it described happened exactly as foretold. The promotion at work, the sudden illness of my sister, all just as it said. But it's the final prediction that keeps me awake at night. It spoke of a night when the moon will shine so bright it casts no shadows at all, when the boundaries between what is and what could be will dissolve like mist. It spoke of doors opening that were never meant to be opened. Now I see it every full moon, standing across the street from my house. Sometimes it waves, Sometimes it points to the sky. Always, it smiles with a mouth that's slightly too wide, slightly too full of teeth that catch the moonlight in impossible ways. Last night, I noticed something new. When I look in mirrors under moonlight, my reflection moves a fraction of a second too late. And sometimes, just sometimes, it winks at me when I'm not winking at all. These tales are more than just stories. They're warnings. The moon reveals what daylight conceals, showing us glimpses of a world that exists alongside our own, a world that's pressing closer with each passing night, with each full moon, with each shadow that moves against the light. Next time you find yourself beneath a full moon, pay attention to the shadows it casts. Listen carefully to the whispers on the wind, and if you see yourself walking home ahead of you on a moonlit night, don't catch up. That's not you up there, not anymore. And if you have your own moonlit story to tell, perhaps it's best to keep it to yourself. Some tales once shared take on a life of their own. They grow in the telling, spreading like shadows at dusk, until you can't remember which parts were story and which parts were truth. And remember, the moon isn't just watching, it's waiting, and it's getting closer. As I write this final warning, I can't help but notice that my shadow on the wall hasn't moved in hours, and the moon tonight, it looks different somehow. Hungry.